going to get started. A couple people said they wanted to come in, and they'll be coming in the door. I want to switch over to the right hemisphere. All right? We're talking theory, and we don't usually do that. It's an abstraction. It's like art, you know? And I've spent a great deal of my life in the creation of something that is an original political philosophy. Sure, there's a lot of scholarship to it. All of my books, I wrote 9 books. All of those books had footnotes and scholarship, and this leads to this, what this shows. But in fact, thank you, Mary. If you're going to build something, you want to go beyond the scholarship. And what I did was based on a very simple notion, and that was that increasingly psychology, along with its first cousin, culture, was rising as a variable that was determining people's ideologies, people's political identifications, people's positions on various issues, and most importantly, where they lined up in political parties and so forth. I'm from a very political family. My great-grandfather was in Chicago politics over 100 years ago. And grandfather, great-uncle was the city auditor, CPA license #1 in Illinois, that kind of thing. So it's in the blood. It's in the blood, and I, as a young kid, was fed a lot of politics by both my mother and father, who were very well educated. And somebody else wants to come in. And we, that's not. I'm going to talk for a while, but I'm not going to talk for the whole hour, okay? I want you to talk, and I want you to go back and look at some things in your own political life and kind of see what examples of this kind of thing are for you. I want it to be a part of the mainstream dialogue. Let me tell you where I started. I started by watching late-night television shows in Chicago on the weekends that were run by people who were journalists with the Tribune, the Sun-Times, and so forth, and they had a number of interesting people in and so forth, and I listened to their arguments, and that really got me started, just as with my parents. What I decided was something that was, for its time, fairly radical, and that was that although objective variables were important, okay, what kind of ethnicity did you represent? Where were you on the socioeconomic standing? What region were you from? All kinds of other things were important. That there was another variable that was kind of creeping up on the rail, like the Kentucky Derby, and nobody could see it right away, but some people started to see it around the 1950s, and you had some good writing by people like Harold Laswell at Yale and so forth. And then you had a massive study that came out of World War II and came out of the Holocaust, and it was called the Authoritarian Personality, okay? Over 1,000 pages, sponsored by the American Jewish Congress and UC Berkeley. And they were interested in a very simple notion, and that is, people were writing about Hitler and Goering and Goebbels and all those awful people, but why did so many people follow? Was there a personality that had a predisposition toward an authoritarian figure and an authoritarian ideology? And the book, of course, was called The Authoritarian Personality. How many of you have read it or at least seen snippets of it? Now that's, I've heard of it. Yeah.
Is it on the web?
It came up with a bunch of scales. There were interviews, surveys, something called the F scale, the fascist scale. Wow, isn't that amazing? This was 1950, all right? And what they said is, look, yes, there are some personality predispositions to the authoritarian perspective, okay? And I'm not going to go through that whole study, it would take too much time, but things like a high need for power, a high need for order, a suppression of impulse, a suppression of introspection. All right? Those were the kinds of things that an authoritarian personality had, okay? I wanted a theory. In other words, I wanted a regular, original political philosophy based on psychology, okay? And what I said is, all right, in order to complete that theory of the authoritarian personality, you had to do something, and that is go to the other end of the spectrum. It was more complicated than that because there were what they call intervening variables, orthogonal, things that were on both sides, and you had to factor all that out. And I did an extensive PhD research that I eventually called the Anti-Authoritarian Personality. It was picked up by Hans Eysenck in the Pergamon series out of Maudsley Hospital, London, and became part of his series. And what I showed was that, yes, if you had an aversion to power relationships, an aversion to over-orderliness, if you were ready to give vent to impulses, if you were ready to be introspective, that was the anti-authoritarian personality. And so now you had a full spectrum, all right? Now you could begin to build, all right? One of the things that I did in one of my studies, and again I'm going to be very quick on this, is I compared the two great ideological figures of American history, okay? Who are they? Everybody knows, Hamilton and Jefferson. Some theorists will say that all American political theory comes from Hamilton and Jefferson, with many iterations and so forth, but still, that's where it began. What kind of personalities did those people have? Well, I took the basic personality characteristic from the authoritarian personality and read extensively. I had a rule: no secondary sources. I permitted myself to read no books on Hamilton and Jefferson. I read essays, I read speeches, I read letters, and so forth. And I did a study that showed that Hamilton, indeed, was the more authoritarian of those two figures, and Jefferson was really not. And so that kind of fit, and that encouraged me to go on. Those kinds of variables are what psychologists call affect variables, feeling, okay, how you feel about various things. There's another set of variables, okay, and it's called cognitive variables, okay? How do you think? Forms of thinking. I'm going to give you a very short question here. Probably the two greatest theorists since the Greeks were the German idealists Kant and Hegel. All right? And I won't go into all their writing and so forth. These were, the best of the best. One of the things that they differed over, are you ready for this? Was the nature of the equation 5 plus 7 equals 12. That sounds like a pretty simple equation, right? The fact is that they bitterly disagreed as to what that equation meant, okay? Kant said it's a synthetic equation. Everyday language, apples and oranges, okay? Everyday language, it was an apples and oranges statement. 5 plus 7 equals 12. Hegel came along one generation later, okay, now Kant was all wrong. It's an analytic statement, okay. Now, you've already figured it out. What's the difference? Why did they differ over it? Was it because of some intellectual reason? No. It's because if you read Kant extensively and you read Hegel extensively, which I have spent a good deal of my life doing, they had very different personalities. Go through this with me. If you have a high need for differentiation for the apple and the orange, okay, you will have a different view of an equation like 5 plus 7 equals 12 than if you have a low personal need, okay? So, who was the conservative of Kant and Hegel? Kant, all right? Because any differentiation at all would be counted as synthetic. Any differentiation, what was it? Very simple. Two integers on one side of the equal sign, one on the other. For Kant, that was enough. That's synthetic. And believe it or not, Kant made an argument, and this is in the Critique of Pure Theory and the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of the Moral, that all of mathematics was synthetic. Well, Hegel said, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, they're all the same thing. It's an apples and apples statement, because why? Because they're all numbers, okay? 5, 7, and 12 are all numbers. And that's not a sufficient differentiation to call it synthetic. And of course, why did Hegel want it to be sufficient to call it synthetic? Because the synthetic cognition was so important in the contradiction, which was the middle stage of the dialectic. And that's what we're talking about today, okay? The middle stage, the contradiction, was not simply a contradiction of, the Cubs versus the White Sox, or the Cubs versus the Brewers, or, things like that. No. It was a contradiction of forms, okay? It was an apple and an orange. And Hegel's view of history, the forms of the mind that perceived and gave meaning to the real world, triangle, 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 square. Okay? That's the way history moves. The paradigm changes. Okay? And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to change the paradigm and have people see that, in fact, if you introspect on the kind of cognitive maps you have in your mind, that's going to have a big difference in how you look at the world. And I developed what I called the natural left. You all know, of course, of dialectical materialism, all right? You know of Feuerbach and, of course, Karl Marx. And that was all based on the dialectic of who owned the means of production, okay? Everybody knows that. What you had was the classical dialectic, which began with Plato and the cave. You remember the parable of the cave and the images on the wall of the cave. It's so important in all of Western thought. It keeps recurring. And that was the classical dialectic. Some people called it the idealist, the idealist dialectic, because it was mind first. Okay? In other words, if you think just of a two-car train, an engine and a passenger car, which is first? Okay? The idealist dialectic has the mind first. It's the mind that pushes history. Okay? But what happened? Well, with Feuerbach and Marx and the materialists, and I don't mean people who want to own big cars, okay? The materialists see the real world pushing the mind, okay? It reversed the order. Everybody following me on that? It reversed the order. And so since roughly the 1840s, okay, up until very recently, dialectical materialism was really the underpinning. You didn't have to be an outright Marxist. You saw the real world as determining how history moved and how people had different views on things. And what I began to see some years ago is, wait a minute, that materialistic view is not fully explanatory. In fact, other variables are moving in of a psychological nature, of a mind nature. To put it very simply, the axis of ideology, which was objectively based, okay, were you male, female, were you white, black, were you rich, poor, all those kind of things, was being impeded on by how you thought and how you felt, okay? To put it simply, the axis was rotating. The axis was beginning to rotate, and I argue that the axis has now passed the 45-degree mark. In other words, the principal ideological correlate is now subjective, not objective. Okay? Check me out. Throughout our history of politics and the elections in politics, the principal correlate for why people voted the way that they did, the principal correlate was your social economic standing. All of you in your studies at SES, you've seen it. All right. Something happened in the year 2000. You know what it was? It didn't make it into the mainstream press very much, but something happened in the year 2000, which I consider to be very significant. SES fell out of first place. Isn't that amazing? In the election of 2000, where you were on the social economic standing was not the principal reason for why you voted for either Gore or Bush. It was whether you were a regular attender of a religious service. Okay? Are you a regular attender of a religious service? That was a better predictor, we're talking statistics here, that was a better predictor of how you voted in 2000. I would suggest that that's a sea change. I mean, that's the same as the iceberg down, at the South Pole. And then a number of other things have happened. For example, Barbara Ehrenreich, and I went to a wonderful lecture that she gave down at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And she talked about women, and she talked about the poor, the kind of things she had typically talked about. But after talking about those for a while, then she switched gears and she began to say, and one of the problems is the misuse of the Myers-Briggs personality test. How many of you know Myers-Briggs? This came out of World War II. What jobs were you fit for? This kind of thing. And guess what? Out of Carl Jung, all right? What do we get? Extroversion, introversion, thinking, feeling. All right? All these dyads. All right? And she said the corporations are using the Myers-Briggs test to weed out introverts. They want all extroverts. All right? And it just absolutely blew my mind. I was sitting right there in front of her and yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's happened. There's a woman by the name of Susan Cain. Have you read her books? C-A-I-N. She wrote a book called Quiet. It's an interesting title. But it was about introverts and consciousness of introverts. Now she's got a second book out, which I haven't read yet, but it's got the word introvert in the title. And it's continuing on the theme. And what you're seeing is, there's even a group now. There is a political interest group. The introverts. Okay? It's not based on anything like ethnicity or money or anything. It's based on your personality. Okay? First time ever that we've had an interest group that was subjectively or psychologically based. You with me? All right. So that's where we are. And what I'm suggesting is that those of us in the Green Party, and I don't want litmus tests and all that kind of crap, but if in fact there has been the axis rotation, then it is time for us to recognize that there may well be, and this is very bold of me to state this, there may well be in the offing a transcendent theory that is based, do not read this, because the last three people I recommended to read it don't speak to me anymore, but it's based on Hegel's chapter called the idea of cognition, and it's in Hegel's Science of Logic. And it talks about the necessity for the synthetic variable for two reasons. One is so that it's equitable. It balances. It's almost like Lao Tzu, yin yang, that we need people who have synthetic minds as well, but also that it's absolutely necessary for the dialectic. You don't get from this stage in history to that next stage in history unless you have the synthetic form, because you can only get to that if you're willing to absorb the new variable. And by new, he meant new in form, new in its basic physical dimensions, okay? It's a whole new concept. And that is why it's been so exciting for me, and I continue to work on this, and I continue to write on it, and say, look, you know, let us begin to have consciousness of our psyches, and those of us who are over on the introverted side, and who have a mind that inclines toward the synthetic cognition, now need to be, and my reviewer put it very well, the necessary theoretical crossweave. Okay? We have groups for all of the various, we have interest groups for all the various objective groups, right? We now need the crossweave that says, okay, here are the kinds of personalities, whether they're white or black, man or woman, rich or poor, gay or straight, doesn't make any difference, okay? What kind of temperament, what kind of psychology do they have? This will be the binder. Because if I say to this gentleman here, sir, that shirt you're wearing, the vertical threads in that shirt, beautiful, really, that is a lovely vertical thread shirt that you have on, okay? And then I went off on something else. No. All right? It is time for the horizontal thread in political theory. Okay? Everybody see what I mean? It's time for the horizontal thread. The thread that has a different personality regardless of their objective identification. And to have that understanding become part of the dialogue, particularly on the progressive side. Okay? Because I think Barbara Ehrenreich was right, that the extroverts have pretty much taken over. The corporations have been very much part of it. And you have basically an extroverted world today. Okay? For those of us who are introverted, all right, introspective, not about all this kind of thing, we need to be a part of it too, just in the patterns of our thinking. Okay? All right, now, I could say much, much more. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. So I believe in a workshop being everybody participates. I want each of you to take a moment, think back to your earliest political activity. And I want you to think about, of course, the individual, what candidate was running for what office, and also the issues, you know, what was being argued over. I want you to go through all that, okay? I want you to go through all that, just like I went through all the writings of Hamilton and Jefferson. Go through that to what was the principal ideological divide when you were young and you were first thinking and acting in some kind of political way. All right, just take a minute. What was the structure of the argument, the underlying ideological divide that you remember as being the differentiation between them and them? Okay, can you think of that a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, now speak up for the old guy because my hearing left me a little while ago. But you know, tell me what was the ideological break? Yeah, go ahead.
Mine was on parochialism.
What that?
Mine was on parochialism.
Parochialism.
I was raised as Roman Catholic,
Okay.
and they told me that here I've been going with my friends for 9 years
Okay.
to school
Okay.
with great effort because it was on the other side of the river.
Okay.
And they said, well, once you reached this age, you now needed to go to this school instead of the one in which you were still going.
Oh, that's
to
great.
buddy.
Oh, that's a nice example.
Yeah, so I just looked at him and said, first off, spoke up the chain of command, as it were, of the politics of the church. and got a rejection on one level, said that it was coming in from the Archbishop. Then I went to the Archbishop, and he told me I couldn't do it, and I told him basically, no, it's not going to happen your way.
Yeah, yeah.
And I rejected it completely.
So that was the great divide, though.
Yeah. But it's
that you
similar to the
first
next
saw.
one, which was Richard Nixon and the war.
All right.
Illegal.
All right. All right. Thank you. That's really very good. What about anybody else? Anybody else want to tell me your first divide, your first ideological separation, where you were on one side and there's another? And yes, ma'am.
I don't know, I felt in the middle, but it was class and neighborhoods.
Okay.
And then my first political, right away I ran into the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in college and read Listen Yankee,
Okay.
which again was about class.
Okay.
You know, who did that revolution benefit? It was the working class.
Yeah, yeah.
And
That's great.
I lived in a neighborhood that was between a working class and a very rich neighborhood. And I was very aware of these neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Were totally different.
Yeah, yeah.
And the cultures.
Yeah, the politics are very different too. Sir, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, because I was born in the former USSR,
Okay.
my initial political idea was socialism, any forms of that are bad, and kind of Ayn Randian free markets were good.
Yeah, yeah.
Things have changed since then, but
Yeah.
that was one of the formative things.
Well, you know, she came from there
I know.
and considered herself to be, what, a socialist refugee or something she called herself. And you know, became very extreme. And I refer to the current Speaker of the House as Ayn Ryan, okay? Because, you know, A-Y-N, R-Y-A-N, right, you know? He really, you know, he's right out of Ayn Rand. You know, I read Ayn Rand as a kid, and of course I was nowhere near as knowledgeable as I am now, but this is really very singular. And, you know, without getting into physiology, I'll get to you in a second, there is some hemispheric stuff going on here. And we can be overly simplistic and say, oh, no, the right hemisphere does this, the left, you know, it's much more complicated than that because there's a lot of interplay. But there's some truth to it, okay? The right hemisphere is the abstract and the conceptual and the creative, and the left hemisphere is the linear, you know, analytic sort of thing. And there are some people, if you listen to Rand Paul, I mean, look, it's painful for me to do this, but I mean, it's so on point. Listen to Rand Paul and think, which hemisphere is working and which hemisphere is not working, you know? I mean, it's really true, you know? He is a single hemisphere thinker that's probably the purest that's, you know, currently on the national scene. Yes, sir. I'll get
Actually, mine is fairly similar to his. I mean, ultimate irony, considering where I am now. But I was raised to be a Republican, essentially.
Yeah.
And the ideology that I was spoon-fed and raised to believe, that before I actually took the time to analyze it, was a very Ayn Randian, you know, like the producers versus the moochers kind of thing. And you're smart, and you're a hard worker, and you need to succeed, therefore that's why you're a Republican.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, sir, George, go ahead.
Well, mine was in high school, and I can't forget, right side of the book, the upper section, was the cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt stepping over a mountain in Cuba with a big club. And that was my first sense of American exceptionalism, in terms of us telling the rest of the world what to do in garnering the resources of the rest of the world. And then that split me off a lot from my classmates, because I was at a very conservative prep school. And then I'm considered the radical. Not invited back.
Okay, so it was a foreign policy divide.
Yeah.
Well, my apologies.
I think for me, I mean, if you look at it like from a social, political, religious level, whatever, like you're saying, when did our divide happen from our political thinking? And I kind of think of that in an economic and social way too. So I think like when I went to teaching,
Yeah.
back in 2008.
Yeah,
I tried it the first time in 2005, it didn't quite work out, but then I went back in 2008 and I stuck with it.
Mhm.
But I separated from that corporate world,
Yeah.
which is where you believe that, you have that belief that if you just keep working hard, you're gonna look good, and you're gonna move up
Yeah.
and make more
Yeah.
money,
Yeah.
and go up the ladder, like the American dream.
Yeah.
And that was important to me coming from my town, because we were
Oh,
a blue collar
yeah.
Catholic family.
Uh-huh.
My dad was a blue collar worker, and my
I see.
mom was a
Yeah,
housewife.
yeah, yeah,
And I thought, okay, my way up is to try to follow that path.
yeah.
But then you realize, that divide for me happened when I said, okay, we're not, that's fantasy land, that's Alice in
Yeah.
Wonderland, that's Kansas. The reality is something much different.
Okay.
The second thing I wanted to say was, when you mentioned that in 2000, the divide with religious voters kind of took over.
Yeah.
Now, but would you say that that is kind of a two-sided coin where that happened because people, so the dot-com bust happened in 2000. I remember having a close friend who says dad's retirement was wiped out when that happened. Would you maybe say that that's kind of, the religious voting has been kind of a result of people's lives kind of worsening?
Yeah.
They say, well, I need to maybe believe in something that's outside of me because everything's kind of worsening and I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what's happening within religions, for example, you look at the Christian faith. Methodist, Congregational, Presbyterians, mainstream, they've lost people, all right? They've lost people. Where's it gone? It's gone over to the people who were laying hands on a certain political figure yesterday. I couldn't believe that picture. I just really, that's the worst thing I've ever seen. Laying hands,
What picture is this?
That's where the real divide was. I'll just share mine. I was raised in a very intellectual family. My father was vice president of Northwestern University. My mother worked for many years at Chicago Public Library and read everything. And it was a house with books and magazines and a lot of talk about politics. The great divide in Chicago was between the pro-union people. Chicago was a very union town. Still is to some extent, by current standards. But there were the unions, and then there were the North Shore people. And of course, we lived up in Evanston because that's where Northwestern was, okay? But there were a lot of North Shore people that said, oh, damn union, and they're all in with the mafia. And, it was a real divide that went even beyond the kind of management worker thing. It was just, an ideological divide. These are good people, these are bad people, that sort of thing. I remember for many years, this is really strange, but it's true. Northwestern University, which was a very conservative school, would not invite Richard J. Daley, the mayor of Chicago, to a football game. Because he was a Democrat and he was involved with the unions. And the people who gave money to Northwestern University didn't want anything to do with the union. Daley couldn't get a ticket to come to a Northwestern football game in Evanston, right across the border. Isn't that amazing? But that was the divide for me, management, labor, Yes, ma'am.
Are you saying that the Myers-Briggs type
Yeah.
inevitably gravitates towards conservative or
Well,
progressive?
okay, that's the second half. That's the second question I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Okay, we've got and this was wonderful. Thank you all who contributed. All right, that's where you started. Okay, that's where you started. But that was kind of objectivist. All right, whether it was Catholic and Protestant, or rich and poor, this kind of thing. Now, where are you? Obviously, you're more sophisticated. You're all much better read and much better had much better experiences in politics. Where are you now? What is the principal ideological divide, and what is the subflooring from that? Do you see a psychological, when you're arguing with your conservative friends, okay, do you see that you're not just arguing labor management or white and black or man and woman or gay and straight, but that there's an underpinning psychology, just a different way of thinking about the world? Do you see that? Yeah, I certainly do. yeah, they're the contemporary issues, and the people on the contemporary issues of different sides. But now it is, you know, and it's probably because I spent a good deal of my life studying this, but I see it all the time. The way you think is just different from the way he thinks, you know. And so you come to the party not just with an opinion on gay marriage or something like that, but you come to the party with a structure, okay, a cognitive structure, and that structure is up against somebody else's structure. And I'm just hopeful that the Green Party will begin to recognize this, to see the subjective variable as important, not in any way to contradict our interests and all the other things, but in fact to support it, okay? If you're pro-environment, it's because you have the kind of mind that's capable of apples and oranges thinking, okay? What do you do with the refuse? You know, what do you do with the refuse? I mean, a story that I have to tell. How many of you know, George, don't cheat on this because you already know this. There is a boat that runs on Lake Michigan 6 months a year. It's called the Badger. How many of you know what the Badger is? The Badger is a car ferry. It used to go from Milwaukee to Ludington. Now it's moved up to, I think, Sheboygan, Ludington, because there's a pontoon boat that goes over to Muskegon from Milwaukee. But anyway, the Badger has technology that is only slightly advanced beyond Robert Fulton and the original steamboat. It burns coal. Can you believe that? They set that keel around 1950. It started service in 1952. And from 1952 up to 2017, they've been throwing what we used to call clinkers into Lake Michigan, filled with zinc and mercury and every possible bad, you know. The Badger is a fun boat. I did take it over because my father's mother was from Traverse City, and she married Traverse City, so we took it over. But, you know, it's just amazing. There's still a coal-burning steamship that is running across Lake Michigan, but without any regard, for years and years and years, without any regard to the environment at all, okay? And people would say, have you noticed this?
And then we'd say, we're saving fossil fuels because we're not driving through Chicago.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's the mindset.
That's right. They didn't go around the lake, around Chicago area. That's right. Well, okay. I mean, I just have to tell that story because, you know, how do you feel about that? Well, you know, do we have here in the Green Party, and I'm not talking about an introverts caucus or anything formal, but do we have some kind of informal but powerful understanding that transcending all of the issues, there is a thought process and a feeling process that is fundamentally different from the Republicans and pretty different from most of the corporate folks in the other party. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that is what I'm saying. And I was thinking about, they asked me, Hillary said, "What do you want the title to be?" And I said, how about the Classical Dialectic 2.0? Because what I'm arguing for is a return to the position between Plato and Hegel. All right? The classical dialectic, the mind-first dialectic. How we think about it really comes first and is part of every substantive issue. And some consciousness of that, I think, would help us greatly. What is our transcendent underpinning of thought? So that's where I am. Anybody else?
But I want to say that that's
Yeah.
a lower level of thinking. So you can't transcend what's immediately in front of you. Which, like, it is that identity politics, like all people
Yeah.
that insisted on voting for Clinton in that election. I said I must because I'm a Democrat. I can't consider alternatives because it goes against my core and whatever they are, right? But that's a low level of thinking, and it also is, it's propping up the old, you know, which seems to be like, you know, the people in power now love that, and then the people that go along with it, they want to keep doing that because they identify with that.
Yeah, I mean,
Like, I want to be a good follower.
isn't any question that, you know, here you have, you know, I started studying this, as I say, as an undergraduate in the late 50s and then the 60s and so forth. And here now we have an individual who the best adjective that's being used to describe him is authoritarian. He's a classical authoritarian personality. He's right out of the book that the American Jewish Congress and Cal Berkeley did and published in 1950. Right out of that book.
But the question I raise is that people can change, right? Like a high school kid that goes into the military, and he's all pro-war and gung-ho, and then he gets in the Middle East and says, oh my God, this is a crock of shit.
Yeah.
You know, and like the GIs in Vietnam all changed and became radicalized.
Not all. Not all.
Is
See,
that?
there was a divide. There was a divide. And
Yeah, but
there-
I'm saying the ones who did radicalize had been pro-military to begin with.
I understand.
Okay, so how do you explain?
All I'm saying is that there was some predisposition in terms of their personality
Okay.
to be appalled by what they saw. Whereas some people said, you know,
Gung-ho.
yeah, gung-ho, yeah, that there was this spectrum. And again, I've been working on this for so long, and I just loved it when this guy came up with this little, he read the book and then he said, you know, what do you want me to say? I said, say what you want. They said, the necessary theoretical cross weave, and I did the thing with the shirts here, you know. We need a theoretical cross weave, okay? We need a strong horizontal position that talks about the introspective personality, the sensitive personality, okay? And also the kind of personality that can deal with differentiated variables. That's what you have to do with the environment. Sure, you're producing a product and it's, okay, and so forth. But what do you do with the effluent? You know, Amoco down at the tip of Lake Michigan and BP bought, and they're dumping junk into Lake Michigan down there around Gary, and you know, it's just appalling. Well, if you have the synthetic kind of mind, you say, wait a minute, that's part of the whole thing. We have to take that into consideration too. The Koch brothers have that. Had these huge pet coke pile, you know, the pet coke, you know, the dust. They've got that down in southeast Chicago, and it's blowing all over, and the kids are breathing it. I mean, you know, all I'm saying is keep up the exact same arguments on the environment, but have an underpinning, okay? Have a substructure that says you have to deal with the whole variable, which includes different kinds of variables. What are you doing, you know, with the residue of your manufacturing? You've been great. I don't want to hold you any longer than you want to be held here.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sir, yes, go ahead.
You know, I came here as someone, you know, I'm fed up with the Democrats and a teacher. We just been getting screwed. You know, a lot of other people, a lot of other sectors of the American economy. They feel the same way. So do you see at any possibility, and I get the sense from you speaking, you have a very, your background in psychology is extensive. Well, you know, it seems to me that Americans are big on identity and on their own identity, and then they translate that into their politics. And like I said, that seems to have created this, like the last guy that was speaking, it's this two sides going at each other with no positive outcomes reached.
Well,
so do you see any possibility of us overcoming this Democrat Republican divide?
All right. Here's kind of a smart ass answer here, and I apologize in advance. Most people think that the best response to the fundamentalist Christians is some kind of secularism. Some people are outright atheists and so forth. I am a Taoist. That's the Taoist ring, and I'm fairly serious about it. I read Lao Tzu, and you know, I take it seriously. the question you ask is a very nice final question, and that is that how do you reconcile the two kinds of mind? How do you get the yin and yang to be seen as the whole, all right? And to be seen in a complementary way, because that's what Taoism teaches, that the opposites are ultimately complementary. See? And, so, that's my answer. Excellent question to end the session. Thank you all. The book is for sale, and, I'll leave an autograph.
We'll see
Thank
you
you all for
Saturday
coming.
too, right?
No, you got me thinking about the thread,
All right.
and also me realizing my thread.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Take care.
Gaze.